She was 21 years old when she married him, an Irish Catholic girl from Brooklyn who had grown up going to Mass on Sundays and working in a factory to keep her family afloat after her father died. She had her whole life ahead of her. By the time she was 28, her hair had turned completely grey, not gradually, all at once, from stress. May Capone spent nearly 7 decades living inside the consequences of one decision, the decision to stay. Through the bootlegging empire, the infidelities, the disease her husband passed to her and to their son, the prison years, the slow deterioration of the man she had married, and the long, quiet decades that followed his death. She never left. She never remarried. She never gave an interview. The world knows Al Capone. Almost no one knows what it actually cost to be his wife. Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, and the girl nobody saw coming. The story of May Capone begins long before Al Capone, in the specific world of the working-class Irish-American immigrant community of Brooklyn, New York, in the 1890s and early 1900s. A world organized around the parish, the neighborhood, and the specific survival logic of people who had crossed an ocean with very little and were building something from scratch on the other side. Mary Josephine Coughlin was born on April 11th, 1897, in Brooklyn, the daughter of Michael Coughlin and Bridget Gorman, both of whom had immigrated separately from Ireland in the 1890s and met in New York. Michael was a laborer. Bridget did housework. They were the specific kind of people who are entirely invisible in history until one of their children does something that makes the historians come looking backward. Not because they were unremarkable people, but because the machinery of the historical record was not designed to capture working-class Irish immigrant families going about the daily business of survival. May grew up in a household organized around work and faith and the specific rhythms of the Brooklyn Irish Catholic community. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the family, a serious and capable girl, someone who took school seriously and possessed the specific quality of careful intelligence that makes a person an excellent reader of other people and of situations. She graduated from high school, which in the early 1900s was genuinely uncommon for women of her class and background. It was an accomplishment that distinguished her in her world, and it is one of the details that has followed every account of her life ever since. The fact that she was more educated than the man she eventually chose. Her father died when she was young, and the death reorganized the family's already precarious financial situation. May left school at 16 to work in a box factory, bringing her wages home to help support her mother and siblings. The factory job was not unusual for young women of her background in that era. It was the specific kind of labor that the immigrant working class relied on, the kind of work that left no room for ambition beyond the immediate necessity of keeping the family solvent. She was doing this work, going to the factory, coming home, attending Mass, navigating the specific social world of the Carroll Gardens neighborhood, when she encountered Alphonse Capone. Carroll Gardens was, in the early decades of the 20th century, one of the most densely Irish neighborhoods in Brooklyn, a place of row houses and church spires, and the specific tight community architecture of immigrant populations that maintain their cultural identity in the face of the larger city around them. The Irish and the Italians in Brooklyn were not always friendly communities. The gang rivalries that ran along ethnic lines were a persistent fact of urban life in that era, and a young woman from the Carroll Gardens Irish community would not normally have been expected to find a romantic partner in the Italian immigrant world. That May did, and that both families apparently accepted the situation without significant resistance, says something about the specific practical logic of how the two communities negotiated the boundaries between them when circumstances required it. Exactly how they met has never been definitively established. Some accounts say they met at a party in the neighborhood. Others say that Al's mother, Teresina Capone, who was a seamstress, knew May from church and arranged the introduction herself. What is established is that Al Capone was 18 years old when they met, and May was 20, 2 years older than the man who would eventually become the most powerful criminal in America. Those 2 years mattered enough to May that she took steps to obscure them. When they married, the marriage certificate recorded both of their ages as 20. Al had added a year to his actual age. May had subtracted 2 years from hers. The arithmetic was deliberate. She was not embarrassed by the relationship. She was simply someone who understood, from the beginning, that managing the public version of a story was sometimes necessary, a quality that would serve her well for the next 7 decades. The Capone who changed everything. Al Capone was, in the years when May first knew him, still in the early stages of becoming what he eventually became. He had grown up in Brooklyn in a Neapolitan immigrant family, his father Gabriel a barber, his mother Teresa a seamstress, who held the household together with the specific fierce competence of a woman who had done difficult things and expected the same from her children. Al was the fourth of 9 children, and he had dropped out of school at 14 after striking a teacher who had hit him first. By the time he met May, he was working for the Brooklyn criminal figure Frankie Yale at a Coney Island establishment called the Harvard Inn, first as a bartender, then in the broader capacity of someone whose usefulness extended beyond mixing drinks. The Harvard Inn was also where Capone received the scars on his left cheek that would give him the nickname Scarface. He had made a remark to a woman at the bar that her brother considered an insult, and her brother responded by slashing him across the face with a knife on 3 separate strokes. The scars were permanent. Capone spent the rest of his life claiming they were war wounds from the fighting in France. He was not in the war. What May saw in this young man, who had no formal education, who was already enmeshed in criminal activity, who was 2 years younger than she was and substantially less educated, is something she never publicly explained. The accounts of people who knew them in those years describe someone who was genuinely charming in a way that photographs don't fully capture, who had a quality of physical confidence and personal warmth that could fill a room. He could make whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person present. That quality of magnetic personal presence was real, and it was the thing that would eventually make him the most influential man in Chicago and the most recognized criminal in American history. The social calculus of their union was noted by the community around them. May was considered to be marrying down. She was more educated. She was Irish and Catholic, in a context where that identity carried a particular kind of respectability, and the young man she was choosing was clearly already moving in criminal circles. Al, by contrast, was considered to be marrying up, getting a wife whose education and background exceeded his own in ways that the Italian immigrant community of that era valued. Their union also had a practical social function. Irish-Italian gang rivalries in Brooklyn were a constant source of violence, and a marriage that connected the two communities was, from certain angles, a useful arrangement. The relationship moved quickly. May became pregnant. Sonny Capone was born on December 4th, 1918. Albert Francis Capone, the only child the two of them would ever have together. 3 weeks after Sonny's birth, on December 30th, 1918, May and Al were married at St. Mary Star of the Sea Church in Brooklyn. Al was under 21, and his parents had to give written consent to the marriage. The community knew them. The priest knew them. It was a neighborhood wedding. What neither the community nor the priest nor May herself fully understood was the chain of consequences that was already in motion. Sonny, the disease, and the weight nobody spoke about. The most devastating fact about May Capone's marriage is not the infidelities, though those were real and ongoing. It is not the imprisonment, though that remade her life entirely. It is something that touched her son before she fully understood who she had married, something that ran through the rest of her life like a current through water. Sonny Capone was born with congenital syphilis. The disease was transmitted from Al, who had contracted it through the continuous pattern of relationships outside his marriage that he maintained from early in his adult life and made very little effort to conceal. Syphilis transmitted to a child in the womb is a serious condition that attacks multiple body systems, and Sonny's infection manifested in a severe mastoid infection, a dangerous inflammation of the bone behind the ear that required emergency brain surgery when he was a young child. He survived the surgery. He was left permanently partially deaf in one ear. The hearing loss was something he managed for the rest of his life. May and Al traveled from Chicago to New York specifically to get Sonny the best possible medical care available. Al Capone had, by the time of Sonny's illness, already established the family in Chicago and was building what would become the most profitable criminal organization in American history. He dropped everything to take his son to the best doctors. People who want to understand Al Capone as a complete person, rather than simply as a symbol of organized crime, often point to moments like this. The man who ordered violence as a business tool was the same man who traveled across the country for his sick child. But the disease did not stop with Sonny. The medical evidence, drawn from the pattern of May's subsequent pregnancies, indicates that she had contracted syphilis from Al at some point during the marriage. She and Al tried to have more children after Sonny. The pregnancies that followed resulted in stillbirths and miscarriages. The disease that Al had brought home from his life outside the marriage had taken from May the children she might otherwise have had. She raised Sonny as an only child, in the specific way of women who have experienced that kind of loss, with a fierce and total devotion that carried within it the weight of everything that had not survived. May reportedly told Sonny, years later, the most direct thing she ever said about what the marriage had cost her personally. She told him not to do what his father had done. She told him his father had broken her heart. It is one of the only direct statements attributed to her in the entire historical record. A woman who kept almost everything private, saying the most essential true thing to the person she trusted most. She was not a woman who complained publicly, but she told her son the truth when it mattered. Her hair turned grey when she was 28 years old. It is one of those small physical facts that carries enormous emotional weight. The specific visible record of what sustained stress does to a body, the external sign of what a person is carrying inside. She was 28. She had a son who had survived brain surgery and was partially deaf. She had a husband who was becoming one of the most powerful and most wanted men in America. She was living in a household where violence was a professional tool and silence was the price of survival. Her hair went grey. Chicago, the empire, and the woman who lived beside it. The Chicago years, roughly from 1920 to 1931, were the years in which May Capone inhabited the most contradictory position imaginable. The family did not move to Chicago immediately after the marriage. May and Sonny stayed in Brooklyn for a few years, while Al established himself in the city, and it was not until approximately 1923 that they joined him there. The delay speaks to something about the practical arrangements of life in that world. Al was building the operation, getting the contacts established, creating the infrastructure of the criminal enterprise that would eventually generate the enormous revenues of the Prohibition years, and the family followed when the foundation was secure enough. When May and Sonny arrived in Chicago, they moved into a house on Prairie Avenue that Al shared with other members of the Capone family, a working arrangement that suited the specific communal living patterns of Italian immigrant families of the era. and that gave May a domestic world that was organized around family rather than isolation. She was the wife of the most powerful man in Chicago, with access to money that most people of her background could not have imagined. She decorated their Palm Island home in Florida lavishly. She drove a custom-designed convertible that Al had provided. She owned expensive jewelry. The life that the criminal empire provided was, in its material dimensions, extraordinary. It was also a life organized around daily contact with things she was not supposed to acknowledge. Al Capone ran the Chicago outfit through the Prohibition years with a combination of organizational intelligence and willingness to use violence that made him the dominant force in the city's illegal liquor trade, gambling operations, and other rackets. He was responsible for deaths, for the ordering of killings, for the use of violence as a regular business instrument. The 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which 7 members of a rival gang were shot in a garage on the north side of Chicago, was widely attributed to the Capone organization, though Al was careful to be in Florida when it happened. May's husband was, by any honest accounting, a man who caused considerable suffering in the world beyond the suffering he caused at home. May knew some version of this. She would have had to be deliberately blind not to know it, and she was not a stupid woman. What she chose to do with that knowledge was to separate it from the private domestic world she inhabited. Al was Al at home. What Al was in the streets was not something she engaged with or discussed or allowed to contaminate the household she was running and the son she was raising. This was the specific survival mechanism of women in that world, the deliberate and continuous maintenance of a line between what you knew and what you acknowledged, between what the husband was professionally and what the wife was responsible for personally. She maintained that line across the entire arc of the Chicago years, through the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, and all the smaller episodes of violence that preceded and followed it, through the years when Al's face was on the front page of every newspaper in America, through the Senate hearings and the federal investigations and the mounting legal pressure that everyone in the orbit of the operation could see building. She went to Mass. She raised Sonny. She decorated the Palm Island home. She drove the custom convertible Al had given her. She was, to all external appearances, simply a wife and mother, living a comfortable life in a prosperous household. The gap between that appearance and the reality of what she was managing internally is the space where May Capone's actual story lives. The infidelities did not fit inside that separation. They were personal in a way that the criminal operation was not. They were about her, about the specific statement made by a husband who chooses other women consistently and without particular concealment. The disease she had contracted was the specific physical consequence of those choices. The children she had lost were the specific reproductive consequence. The emotional consequence was what she named to Sonny years later, in the most compressed and honest sentence she ever produced for the historical record. He broke my heart. The Palm Island estate in Florida, a magnificent property on a private island outside Miami, purchased by Al in the late 1920s, was the domain May made her own. She had the freedom to furnish and design it as she chose, and she chose well. She loved that house. It represented something, a home she had built rather than simply inherited, a space that carried her aesthetic judgment and her sense of what a family's environment should feel like. The jewelry that was eventually stolen in a burglary at the Palm Island home was irreplaceable, and its loss was one of the many small indignities of a life that delivered its gifts wrapped in costs. The fall, tax evasion, Alcatraz, and the years of vigil. The federal government's pursuit of Al Capone had been building for years before it finally produced a result. Elliot Ness and his team of investigators, the men who would eventually be immortalized in the press as the Untouchables, had been working to build a case around prohibition violations, trying to document the bootlegging operation in enough detail to prosecute it. They made some progress. They disrupted some of the breweries. They created problems for the organization at the operational level. But they could not build the kind of airtight criminal case that would send Capone to prison for the years that the government wanted. The IRS investigators took a different approach. They went into the financial records of the operation and began building a meticulous case around the money itself, specifically around the enormous income that Capone had received from his criminal enterprises and had not reported to the federal government for tax purposes. The legal theory was simple. Criminal income is still income, and failure to pay taxes on it is a federal crime. The investigative work was painstaking, requiring years of tracing cash flows through the complex arrangements that Capone's operation used to obscure its finances. But it worked. The federal government's pursuit of Al Capone succeeded not through the murder charges that might have been built, and that would have been the more obvious approach, and not through the prohibition violations that were the most visible dimension of his operation. It succeeded through his taxes. Treasury Department investigators built a case around what Capone had failed to do with his money, specifically, his failure to pay income tax on the income flowing through his operation. It was a technical solution to a spectacular problem. Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion in October 1931. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay back taxes and court costs. He was sent first to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and then, in August 1934, to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, on an island in San Francisco Bay, a mile and a half of cold Pacific water from the nearest shore, a facility designed specifically to hold the most difficult federal prisoners in conditions that minimized contact with the outside world. May's life reorganized entirely around the imprisonment. Everything that had structured the previous decade, the Palm Island home, the Chicago household, the social world that existed in proximity to Al's operation, the financial resources that the criminal empire generated, was suddenly organized around a different center of gravity. The fact that Al was behind bars and the life they had built together was now on hold indefinitely. The flow of money from the criminal organization had slowed and then largely stopped. The operation continued under other leadership, but it did not continue to support May and Sonny at the scale it had before. The organizational payments, the reported $600 a week, kept the basic arithmetic of their lives functional, but required May to manage the household with a careful attention to resources that the flush years had not demanded. She had always been the person who understood the family's practical situation. Now that understanding had to be applied with more discipline than before. The organization's leadership recognized that Capone behind bars was no longer an operational asset and potentially a liability, and they paid him a stipend, approximately $600 a week by some accounts, to stay quiet and stay away. May managed what remained. She tracked expenses. She maintained the Palm Island property. She preserved whatever financial stability the family still had against the mounting costs of lawyers, taxes, and ordinary living. She visited Al in Atlanta. She visited him at Alcatraz, which required considerably more from her. The trip from Florida was long. The ferry to the island was the only access point, and the visits were conducted under prison rules that limited what could be said and for how long. She went consistently. She was one of his most reliable visitors in a place where reliable visitors were rare. The loyalty she demonstrated in those years, visiting a man who had given her a disease, who had given her son a disease, who had broken her heart in a federal prison on an island in the Pacific, is the thing that makes her story genuinely difficult to reduce to a simple narrative. She also managed the press as carefully as she managed the finances. When speculation mounted about Al's mental deterioration inside Alcatraz, the odd behaviors, the confusion, the wearing of winter clothes in heated cells, May's public communications described him as being in a state of dejection and emotional distress, aggravated by the harsh conditions. What she carefully avoided saying was that his organs were being progressively destroyed by advanced syphilis that had been going untreated for years, and that his brain was being dismantled by a disease that had no cure available at that time, and that had been progressing since the early years of their marriage. The formal diagnosis, neurosyphilis, syphilis of the brain, was made in February 1938. May managed that information with the same deliberate care she had applied to everything about the marriage. She protected him from the press. She protected Sonny from the full weight of what was happening. She absorbed it herself. Al Capone was released from Alcatraz in 1939, transferred briefly to a prison hospital in California, and released entirely in November 1939, having served approximately 7.5 years. He spent time at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore receiving treatment before May brought him home to Florida. Palm Island, the long ending, and the grief she never showed. The man who came home to Palm Island in March 1940 was not the man who had left for prison in 1932. That man had been 32 years old and physically powerful, still possessed of the mental acuity that had made him the most feared man in Chicago, despite the beginnings of the disease. The man who returned was 40 years old. By clinical assessment, his brain was functioning at approximately the level of a 12-year-old child. The neurosyphilis had done what it does in its advanced stages. It had attacked the brain systematically and irreversibly, destroying the tissue that housed the personality and the intelligence and the memory and the judgment of the man May had married. He had conversations with people who were not there, talking to long-dead friends as though they were present in the room. He had moments of something like clarity, and then the clarity would dissolve. He needed constant supervision. He could not be left alone. May became his full-time caretaker, not in the delegated way of someone who arranges for professional nurses, but in the daily physical and emotional way of someone who has taken on the entire responsibility of another person's existence. She managed his medications. She managed his schedule. She kept reporters, who were circling the Palm Island estate constantly, hoping for a glimpse of the fallen gangster, away from him. She managed the specific humiliation of keeping private the fact that one of the most feared men in American history now wandered his Florida estate in confusion, unreachable by reason or memory. The mob had moved on. New figures had taken the positions Al had held. The organization had restructured around his absence with the efficient adaptability that successful criminal enterprises maintain, and he was not needed or consulted. He was a retired figure receiving a modest stipend, cared for by his wife on a private island in Florida, getting progressively worse. The arrival of penicillin in wider medical use in the early 1940s offered some partial relief. His physical symptoms improved with treatment, and there were periods of stabilization. But the damage to his brain was beyond what any treatment could reverse. By 1946, the clinical picture had not meaningfully changed. The man who had run the Chicago outfit, who had managed millions of dollars in criminal revenue, who had navigated the politics of organized crime with the intelligence of a natural executive, that man was gone. What remained was someone who needed May the way a child needs a parent. On January 21st, 1947, Al Capone had a stroke. He was 48 years old. He recovered briefly, enough for those around him to hope, but then developed pneumonia. He died on January 25th, 1947, at the Palm Island home, with May and Sonny and other family members at his side. He was buried first at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, and later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he rests beside his father Gabriel and his brother Frank. May was 50 years old. She had been with him for more than half of her life. She had never given an interview. She had never published anything. She had never leveraged the specific currency of the Capone name for her own benefit. She had simply been there, through all of it, doing whatever being there required. After the death, the finances were what remained, diminished, carefully managed, the residue of a fortune that had been consumed by legal fees and taxes and medical expenses across 20 years of Al's legal troubles and illness. She and Sonny sold the Palm Island estate in 1952. The house she had decorated with such care, the domain that had been most specifically hers, was gone. The sun, the lawsuits, and the long silence. Sonny Capone built his own life with the specific challenges of a person who carries one of the most infamous names in American history and is determined to live anyway. He was, in many respects, the most visible measure of what the marriage had cost May. The son who had been born with a disease his father gave him, who had survived brain surgery as a child, who had grown up partially deaf in a household where his father was first a bootlegger, then a prisoner, then a man being slowly consumed by neurological damage. Sonny was the person May had most consistently protected, from the moment she travelled from Chicago to New York for his medical care, through the years of managing the press scrutiny that surrounded the family, through the prison years when she tried to give him as normal a life as possible in the specific abnormal circumstances they inhabited. What Sonny had said about his mother in the rare interviews he gave across his adult life was consistent. She was devoted. She was strong. She was the center of the family in a way that his father, for all his power in the world outside the home, had never quite been inside it. The family's stability, to whatever extent stability was achievable in the specific conditions they were living in, was May's work. He changed his name legally to Brown for a period, not to abandon the family, but to create enough space from the notoriety to hold a job and move through the world without the name preceding him everywhere. He eventually returned to the Capone name. He worked in ordinary occupations, ran a restaurant in Florida, married, had 4 daughters, and stayed entirely clear of organized crime. May fought for Sonny and for Sonny's children with the same force she had applied to everything else. When the television series The Untouchables aired in 1959, the fictionalized account of Elliot Ness and Al Capone that renewed intense public fascination with the family. Sonny's daughters were bullied at their school because of the Capone name. May filed a lawsuit to protect her grandchildren from the harassment that a television program had made worse. She was 62 years old. The lawsuit did not produce significant legal results, but the filing itself was consistent with who she had always been, someone who would do whatever the situation required to protect the people she was responsible for, regardless of the likely outcome. She lived quietly in Florida for the remaining decades of her life. She did not give interviews in those decades. She did not sell a memoir. She did not sit down with any of the many journalists and documentary makers who would have paid well for an account of what the marriage had actually been like from the inside. She maintained, to the end, the specific privacy that had been her defining characteristic since she first appeared in the historical record as the young woman who adjusted the ages on her marriage certificate. Sonny Capone died in 2004 at the age of 85. He had outlived his father by 57 years. May had already been gone for 18 years by then. She died on April 16th, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She was buried beside Al at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, returned to the ground of the city that had defined the Capone name, beside the man she had never left. What the marriage actually cost. May Capone's hair went grey at 28. Her son was born with a disease her husband had given him. The disease likely contributed to the stillbirths and miscarriages that followed, taking the children she tried to have. She spent the prime years of her life managing the household of a man who was simultaneously one of the most dangerous criminals in America and one of the most consistently unfaithful husbands of his era. She spent years of her middle life visiting him in federal prison on an island in the Pacific. She spent the final years of his life as the full-time caretaker of a man whose brain had been destroyed by the disease he had transmitted to her, until he died at 48 and left her to manage what remained. She told her son his father had broken her heart. She never told anyone else anything. The word that has most often been applied to May Capone across the decades of writing about her life is loyalty. She was loyal. She demonstrated loyalty at a scale and across a duration that most people would have abandoned long before the finish. But loyalty by itself does not explain what she was doing or why. She was a Catholic woman from the specific tradition that understood marriage as a sacrament and a permanent covenant. She was a woman whose own father had died young and who had organized her identity from an early age around the role of the person who stays and manages and endures when others cannot. She was a woman who had constructed her entire adult life inside this marriage, and for whom the alternative, whatever form it might have taken, was not something the architecture of herself allowed her to fully consider. She also, by every account, genuinely loved Al Capone, not despite what he was, because of who he was to her specifically, the young man from Carroll Gardens who had charmed her family, who had given her Sonny, who had given her the house she loved, who had chosen her, in his particular way, above all the other women he had access to. He broke her heart. She also loved him. Both things were true at the same time, and she lived inside both of them simultaneously for nearly 7 decades. The marriage destroyed parts of her life that could not be recovered. The children she lost, the years of fear, the physical toll of the disease, the grey hair at 28, the Palm Island estate sold in 1952, the fortune consumed by the legal system. It also gave her the specific life she had, the son she raised, the grandchildren she protected with lawsuits and love in equal measure. May Capone died on April 16th, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She had survived the empire, the trials, the prison years, the caregiving, and 39 years of quiet Florida life. And she left without having given anyone outside the family a true account of what all of it had looked like from where she was standing. That silence was not weakness. It was the specific kind of strength that takes a lifetime to build and that very few people ever fully manage to hold. What May Capone's life ultimately demonstrates is something that the standard narratives of organized crime tend to skip past in their focus on the men at the center of the action. The women who lived inside those worlds paid costs that were real and permanent and not chosen, and they paid them without the recognition or the resources or the public sympathy that might have made the paying easier. They were expected to be loyal, and they were loyal, and the loyalty was taken as simply what wives in that world did. Unremarkable, expected, not particularly worth examining. May Capone deserves to be examined. The girl from Carroll Gardens who graduated from high school when girls in her situation rarely did, who went to work in a factory at 16 to keep her family intact, who fell in love with the wrong man and stayed with him through everything the wrong man produced. She was a person of genuine intelligence and genuine endurance, and the specific shape her life took was not simply the passive result of what Al Capone did. It was also the active result of what she chose. day after day, across 68 years of marriage and widowhood, to do with what she had been given. She chose to protect her son. She chose to protect Al, even when he did not protect her. She chose silence over exposure, dignity over complaint, endurance over whatever the alternatives might have been. Those choices had costs. They also had a kind of integrity that is worth recognizing. May Capone died on April 16th, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She outlived the empire, the trials, the prison, the caregiving, and the man who had broken her heart by 39 years. She left nothing for the historical record but the facts, the dates, the addresses, the medical records of a son's surgery, the marriage certificate where both their ages had been adjusted to 20. That is enough. It is, in fact, more than most people leave. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She is everything the word grace was invented to describe. A voice so pure it once stopped a CBS broadcast in its tracks when the network couldn't figure out whether what they were hearing was actually human. An Oscar for her first film. A career that spans from the post-war stages of England to the Netflix screens of the 2020s. But beneath the composure and the warmth and the extraordinary voice, Julie Andrews has lived a private life that is considerably more complicated and more human than her public image suggests. 2 marriages, 2 very different men, a family assembled across 2 continents through love and loss and international adoption, and a grief after her second husband died that she has described as something she still carries every day. This is the story of the 2 men who knew her best, and what those relationships actually cost and gave. Walton-on-Thames and the girl who was already performing. Before either husband, before Mary Poppins, or The Sound of Music, or any of the films that made her face the most recognizable in the world for a decade, there was a girl in Surrey, England, who had been performing since before she understood what performing was. Julia Elizabeth Wells was born on October 1st, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, the daughter of Ted Wells and Barbara Morris Wells, both of whom were involved in the world of light entertainment in the specific British tradition of variety performance that existed in the decades between the 2 world wars. Her parents' marriage was not a happy one, and it did not survive her early childhood. Her mother eventually remarried a vaudeville comedian and singer named Ted Andrews, whose surname Julie would eventually take professionally. The new household was organized around performance in the most literal possible sense. Her mother and stepfather had a professional act, and Julie was incorporated into it by the time she was old enough to hold a note, which was very young indeed. The childhood she later described in her memoir, Home, a memoir of my early years, published in 2008, was not a simple or unclouded one. Her parents' separation and her mother's remarriage, the constant travel that the Variety Act required, the specific instability of a life organized around theatre bookings and provincial hotels, these were the conditions that produced the specific quality of self-reliance and emotional resilience that would define her adult life. She was performing in variety shows across England by the time she was 9 or 10 years old, not because she had been given no choice, but because the performing was the thing she was genuinely most alive doing. By the time she was 12, she had a voice that her vocal coach, Madame Lillian Stiles Allen, described as something she had never encountered in her professional experience. A 4-octave range, with a specific quality of clarity and control that extended from the lowest notes a grown woman might sing to the highest notes that a trained soprano could reach. This was not a manufactured thing. It was simply there, waiting for the training that would help her understand and use it. Madame Stiles Allen trained her seriously, with the care that one brings to something genuinely exceptional, and the girl who had been singing in pantomime and variety quickly became someone who could hold an audience entirely still, simply by opening her mouth. At 13, she became the youngest solo performer ever to appear at a royal variety performance. The annual concert, given in the presence of the British royal family, representing the top tier of British entertainment. That distinction spoke to the specific quality of what she could do, and it set the trajectory for everything that followed. She was already, at 13, a professional performer of serious standing, someone who occupied the stage with a natural command that most performers spend their entire careers trying to develop. And it was in this world, the world of English variety entertainment, of touring productions and provincial theatres, and the specific working-class professional life of performers who travelled with their acts and slept in theatrical digs, that she first encountered the person she would eventually marry. He was a boy she met at 11 at a show in Luton, and he was 12 years old and completely captivated by what he saw. Tony Walton, the boy who became her dearest friend. Tony Walton was 12 years old when he first saw Julie Andrews perform. He was in the audience at the George Hotel in Luton, England, in 1948, watching a production of Humpty Dumpty, a Christmas pantomime of the kind that was the bread and butter of the English variety world. And the girl who appeared on stage captured his attention in a way that he found himself determined to address. After the show, he went backstage to get her autograph. He got it. It was, by any measure, an unpromising beginning for a love story. An 11-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy exchanging signatures at a stage door in a provincial English town. But what happened afterward was something more unusual and more sustained. They became pen pals. The correspondence went on for years. Two young English people with theatrical interests, writing to each other across the distance of their respective growing-up years, maintaining a connection that had begun in the specific charged moment of watching someone perform and wanting, immediately, to know them better. Tony Walton was, from early on, interested in the visual arts in the specific way that some people are drawn toward the theatre as designers rather than as performers. He had an eye for space and colour and costume, and the visual grammar of how the stage communicates to the people sitting in front of it. He would eventually become one of the most celebrated production designers in the history of American and British theatre, winning an Academy Award for his costume designs for All That Jazz in 1980 and multiple Tony Awards for his stage work. Designs for Pippin, Guys and Dolls, 1776, Company, Equus, and many other major productions. He was, by the end of his career, recognized as one of the great visual artists that the theatre had produced. But when he and Julie Andrews married on May 10th, 1959, at St Mary Oatlands Church in Weybridge, Surrey, he was still a young man with enormous potential and a career in its early stages, alongside a woman whose career had already become something extraordinary. Julie was 23 and already a Broadway star. She had appeared in The Boyfriend on Broadway in 1954 at 19 years old, had starred in My Fair Lady in 1956 as Eliza Doolittle opposite Rex Harrison's Professor Higgins, a role that required her voice and her timing and her specific quality of emotional honesty in ways that confirmed she was not simply a remarkable singer, but a genuine actress, and had returned to Broadway in Camelot in 1960 as Queen Guinevere. She was, in the world of musical theatre, one of the most significant performers of her generation. The marriage began in the circumstances that would eventually strain it. Two creative people with strong professional identities, working in fields that took them to different places and demanded their full attention when they were working. Julie was in New York for Camelot. Tony was developing his career in both London and New York, with the demands of stage design requiring him to be where the productions were mounting. The specific geography of two theatre careers is not always kind to a marriage. The decade of correspondence they had maintained before marrying had given them a real foundation. They had known each other since childhood and had arrived at the altar with the specific trust of two people who had been genuinely talking to each other for years. That foundation was real. It did not solve the geography, and the geography was the structural problem of everything that followed. As Julie's career accelerated after Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music into something that required her to be in Hollywood virtually continuously, and as Tony's career as a designer required his presence in the productions he was designing, often in New York and London, the distances accumulated. Weeks became months, long stretches on different continents, conflicting schedules, the specific exhaustion of being famous and in demand, and still trying to maintain a domestic life across an ocean. It wore on them both in ways that the letters they had exchanged as teenagers could not have prepared them for. Their daughter, Emma Walton Hamilton, was born on November 27, 1962, right before the whirlwind of Mary Poppins, which Julie filmed in the summer of 1963 and which was released in August 1964 to transform her from a stage star into the most famous actress in the world. Emma's arrival was a genuine joy in the marriage. She has grown into a significant creative figure in her own right, a children's author who has collaborated with her mother on more than 30 books and who has been a consistent and warm presence in the public account of the Andrews family. The Mary Poppins years, and then the Sound of Music years that immediately followed, were the years when the gap between what the marriage needed and what the career demanded became most visible. Julie was one of the most sought-after actresses on earth. The Sound of Music in 1965 became the highest-grossing film in history at that point, a record it held for several years. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Mary Poppins and was nominated for The Sound of Music. The entire apparatus of Hollywood stardom was organized around her presence and her schedule. Tony's career was real and distinguished and genuinely his own. But it was also, by the mid-1960s, the secondary career in a household defined primarily by Julie's success. The specific geography of that dynamic, the location shoots in Hollywood and elsewhere that kept Julie on the American West Coast, while Tony's work was often pulling him toward New York and London, created distances that accumulated into something neither of them could sustain. In November 1967, Julie filed for divorce in Santa Monica, California, citing the varying demands of their careers and the obvious strains that constant separation had placed on the marriage. There was also, by November 1967, someone else, a director named Blake Edwards, who had recently acquired his own divorce and who was, as a Time magazine brief noted at the time, at hand, in a way that implied the relationship was already developing. The statement she released was precise and dignified, clearly the work of someone who had thought carefully about how to characterize what had happened. The divorce was finalized in 1968, and what followed is one of the more genuinely unusual outcomes of a Hollywood divorce. They remained friends. Really, genuinely, lastingly friends. The kind of post-divorce relationship that is extremely rare and that requires specific emotional maturity from both parties. They collaborated on children's books together, Tony illustrating the work he and Julie and Emma produced as a creative family. They appeared at events honoring each other's work. They co-parented Emma with a warmth and a generosity that Emma has described as one of the foundational blessings of her childhood. When Tony Walton died on March 2, 2022, at the age of 87, from complications following a stroke, Julie's statement about him described him as her dearest and oldest friend. A description that had the specific weight of someone speaking not about a former spouse, but about someone who had been genuinely and continuously present in her life for more than 70 years. She called him a titan of the arts. She said his talent was simply monumental. She said she would miss him more than she could say. What it required of both of them to transform a marriage into a friendship and to sustain that friendship across 50 years, across his second marriage to General Leroy in 1991 and her second marriage to Blake Edwards, across the children's books they made together with Emma and the family occasions where they still appeared side by side, is not something either of them has fully articulated in public. But it was visible in every account each gave of the other across the decades that followed the divorce. And it was visible, most of all, in the statement Julie released when he died. Not the statement of someone performing decency toward a former spouse, but the genuine expression of someone who had lost one of the most important people in her life. The first marriage, in the end, produced one of the more quietly remarkable things that marriages can produce when they are handled by two people of sufficient grace. A friendship that outlasted the romance by more than half a century, and that kept generating things: children's books, shared grandchildren, mutual care, long after the official structure had ended. The therapist's parking lot, and the beginning of everything. Blake Edwards was a man who had built his career on a specific quality of irreverent intelligence, the ability to make audiences laugh while also making them feel something they hadn't expected to feel. He had grown up in Hollywood in the most literal sense, the son of a theatrical director and the grandson of a silent film director. And the industry was in his blood in the way that it only is for people who were born inside it rather than having arrived from outside. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the more significant directors in Hollywood. Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1961, with Audrey Hepburn and a Henry Mancini score that became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of American cinema, had established him as someone who could work with great female stars and produce something genuinely beautiful. The Pink Panther series, which began in 1963 with Peter Sellers as the magnificently incompetent Inspector Clouseau, had established him as someone who understood comedy at a structural and almost architectural level, not simply as a collection of jokes, but as a machine for producing a specific kind of delight. He was also a screenwriter of genuine skill, someone who understood narrative and character in ways that went beyond the director's craft. He was also, by the mid-1960s, going through the end of his first marriage to actress Patricia Walker, with whom he had two children, Jeffrey and Jennifer, in the specific, painful, slow-motion way that marriages sometimes end when both parties have recognized that something fundamental has broken, and neither has yet found the mechanism to make the ending official. He was seeing a therapist during this period, working through whatever the marriage had cost him and trying to understand himself better. As was Julie Andrews, who had separated from Tony Walton and was navigating the same specific, uncertain territory. Therapy was something Julie has spoken about with genuine credit over the years. She sought it in the aftermath of the first marriage's dissolution, in the specific condition of someone who had been working since the age of 9 and had not always had the time or the space to examine what any of it, the performing, the marriage, the specific costs of a life organized entirely around other people's expectations, had actually required of her interior self. She has described the process as having saved her life in a way. That is not hyperbole. It is the account of someone who found, through the specific work of therapy, a version of herself that was more stable and more self-aware than the one she had been carrying, and who arrived at the relationship with Blake Edwards from that position rather than from the unexamined one. Blake had done the same work, for his own reasons, and through his own specific reckoning with the first marriage and the career and the patterns that the career had installed in him. They were, in other words, Two people who had genuinely looked at themselves before they looked at each other, and what they found in each other, once they were actually paying attention, was something that the earlier version of each of them might not have been able to fully recognize or receive. The story of how their relationship actually began has the quality of something slightly absurd and entirely charming. They had met briefly, once, in 1959. Ships that pass in the night, as Julie later described it to interviewers, at some event neither of them could precisely remember. And then years later, both of them happened to be attending therapy sessions in the same part of Los Angeles, and they encountered each other in the parking area near the building. Blake, who was in his Rolls Royce, rolled down his window and honked at her. She recognized him. What happened next was the specific unfolding of two people discovering they had more in common than they had realized. The invitation to a film screening, then dinner, then the specific discovery that both of them were newly separated and available and drawn to each other in ways they were ready to explore. She described him, in later interviews, as the most charismatic and interesting fellow she had ever met. Said she felt, from the beginning of their acquaintance, that she would never find anyone quite like him again. He was 13 years her senior. He had the specific quality of confidence and creative force that comes from someone who has built something real over decades of professional work, and it was compelling to her in the way of genuine recognition rather than mere fascination. He drove her along the Pacific Coast Highway and eventually pulled over on the Malibu Bluffs to watch the ocean and the light. It was, by her account, unbelievably romantic. He was the kind of man who understood how to create a moment, and who understood that moments were not simply settings for conversations, but communications in themselves. He had already written the film Darling Lily with her specifically in mind, a World War I musical spy story that seemed designed to challenge every comfortable assumption the public had developed about Julie Andrews. The Mary Poppins and Maria von Trapp images had given the world a specific picture of who she was: warm, clear-voiced, essentially uncomplicated. Blake Edwards was not interested in that picture. He wanted to show the audience what was underneath, and he was convinced that what was underneath was considerably more interesting. They married in November 1969 at Julie's home. He was 47 years old and she was 34. The specific quality of what they brought to the relationship: two adults who had each been through the end of a first marriage, who had each done genuine therapeutic work to understand their own patterns, and who chose each other from that position of greater self-knowledge, is part of what distinguished this second marriage from the first. Darling Lily and the family they built. The Darling Lily production, which had begun development before their marriage and was released in 1970, was the first creative collaboration of the second marriage. It was also a commercial failure, an expensive, ambitious, beautiful film that the studio released in a version significantly different from what Edwards had originally intended, cut down and reconfigured in ways that removed much of what had made it distinct. The critics and the public of 1970 were not receptive to what remained. It lost money. It was written off as a disaster. The failure of Darling Lily was one of the early tests of the marriage's resilience. Creative partnerships between two powerful artistic figures are always complicated by shared failures, particularly when the failure is public and expensive. But the marriage held. Julie understood that the failure was not the last word on the work. She had seen enough of how the industry treated ambitious films to know that the studio's version and the director's vision were not always the same thing. Blake understood that her patience with the failure and her loyalty to what he had been trying to do was a form of commitment that went beyond what the contract required. They assembled, in the years of the early marriage, a family of extraordinary size and complexity. Julie brought Emma, her daughter, with Tony Walton. Blake brought his two children from his first marriage to Patricia Walker, Jeffrey Edwards and Jennifer Edwards. Together, they tried to have biological children and were not successful. In 1974, they adopted a daughter from Vietnam, naming her Amelia, Amy Lee Edwards. She was approximately 2 months old when she arrived. The following year, 1975, they adopted another Vietnamese daughter, Joanna Lynn Edwards. This was not a casual or convenient decision. The Vietnam War had produced an enormous number of orphaned children by the mid-1970s, and the specific conditions in the orphanages were ones that Julie had felt compelled to witness for herself. She travelled to Southeast Asia to see firsthand what was happening, to understand the reality of the lives these children were living before any decision about adoption was made. What she saw there changed her permanently. She has described the experience in terms that speak to something more than parental sentiment, a confrontation with the specific human cost of the war, witnessed in the faces of children who had nothing and needed everything. Amy and Joanna travelled the world with their parents through the years of their childhood, eventually settling primarily in Gstaad, Switzerland, the Swiss mountain village that became the family's permanent home after Blake Edwards relocated them away from Hollywood. The move to Switzerland was precipitated by his fury at the studio system that had repeatedly interfered with his films. After his film Wild Rovers was cut and reconfigured without his consent. In 1971, he had reached a breaking point with the machinery of the Hollywood studios and decided that the distance of an ocean would serve both his creative work and the family's well-being. Gstaad was, in Julie's descriptions of it, simply a village, with animals and mountains, and the specific ordinary life of a community organized around something other than the entertainment industry. For a family that included 5 children of different ages and different backgrounds, the Swiss setting offered a stability and a privacy that Los Angeles could not have provided. The children grew up together in that village, in whatever complicated and rich way the specific combination of their backgrounds produced. Blake continued directing throughout the Swiss years. The Pink Panther films continued, each one featuring Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau, and each one adding to the franchise that had become one of the most commercially reliable properties in world cinema. He made 10 in 1979, with Dudley Moore and Bo Derek, which was a substantial commercial hit. He made S.O.B. in 1981, a savage satire of the Hollywood studios that was clearly personal in a way his other films were not. The story of a director trying to recut his failed film into something closer to his original vision, which had a specific autobiographical resonance that the film's critics noted. He made Victor/Victoria in 1982. Victor/Victoria was the fullest expression of what the creative partnership between Blake and Julie produced when it was working at its absolute best. Julie played a woman in 1930s Paris who impersonates a man who impersonates a female cabaret performer, a series of disguises nested within each other, a comedy of identity and performance and gender that was both witty and genuinely warm. It was a commercial and critical success, and it gave Julie the kind of role that expanded the public's understanding of who she was and what she could do. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, with Julie receiving a Best Actress nomination, and it won the Oscar for Best Original Score for Henry Mancini and Leslie Bricusse. The Broadway adaptation of Victor/Victoria, which Julie starred in 1995, extended the creative collaboration into the final decade of the marriage. She was nominated for a Tony Award for her performance, returning to the theatre that had made her famous in the first place, in a work that her husband had created with her at its centre. Blake attended the show as often as he could across its run. The stage production was, in its way, a full-circle moment. The girl who had been performing in Luton pantomimes, now performing for Broadway audiences in a role that her husband had written because he understood something about her that she was still discovering for herself. 41 years, one voice, and one loss. The marriage of Julie Andrews and Blake Edwards lasted 41 years, from November 1969 until his death on December 15, 2010. In any accounting of Hollywood marriages, a category notorious for its brevity and its tendency toward dissolution under the pressures of fame and ambition and constant professional disruption. 41 years is not simply a long time. It is a specific sustained achievement, the product of two people who made an ongoing and deliberate choice to protect what they had built. Julie described their approach to the marriage, in a 2015 interview with Good Morning Britain, as taking it one day at a time. The phrase is simple enough to sound like a cliché and specific enough to sound like the truth. They had not treated the marriage as something that would simply persist once it existed. They had treated it as something that needed to be chosen, repeatedly and consciously, across the years. The result, she said, looking back from the position of someone who had done it, was that 41 years later, they were still there. She described marriage in a 2019 Vanity Fair interview as a big up and down graph, as the hardest work she had ever done. That assessment, coming from someone who had also maintained an extraordinary performing career across 7 decades and raised 5 children in 2 countries, is worth taking at face value. The marriage required things of her that the career, however demanding, did not require in the same way. Blake Edwards was not a simple or easy man. He was brilliant and driven and temperamentally strong in the way of people who have spent decades fighting the specific institutional battles of the film industry. Battles over creative control and studio interference, and the gap between what an artist intends and what the commercial machinery produces. He had learned, through repeated experience, that the industry would compromise his work when it could. He fought back. The fighting required a certain quality of stubbornness and force that did not always make him comfortable to be around. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew the marriage from the inside, genuinely in love with Julie and genuinely invested in the partnership they had built together. Both things were true. The vocal surgery in 1997 was one of the defining tragedies of her later career. She had developed a non-cancerous growth on her vocal cords and underwent an operation at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York to address it. The surgery was intended to be straightforward, and the medical team expected her to recover fully. Instead, the procedure damaged her vocal cords in a way that proved permanent. The 4-octave range that had been the foundational gift of her entire life, the voice that had made audiences weep and had defined what musical theatre and film could achieve, was essentially gone. She could still speak. She could not sing in the way she once had, and she has said, across the years since, that she will never recover that voice. She filed a malpractice lawsuit against the surgical team and eventually reached a financial settlement, but the settlement was not the voice. The voice was gone, and the specific grief of losing the thing that had been most centrally who she was, professionally, creatively, personally, was a grief that ran parallel to all the other griefs and joys of the years that followed. Blake was at her side through it. He had built his professional relationship with her around her talent, and he had also married a person who was considerably more than that talent. He helped her navigate the loss. In the years after the surgery, with singing no longer available, she moved more deeply into the work she could do, the children's books, the acting roles that didn't depend on her voice in the same way, the producing and narrating and public appearances that allowed her to remain present in the culture while managing what the surgery had taken. Blake Edwards died on December 15, 2010, at the age of 88, from complications following a brief bout of pneumonia. The onset of the illness had been relatively sudden, and the end came quickly. He did not have the kind of prolonged final illness that sometimes allows the people who love someone to prepare for what is coming. Julie was left in the specific position of someone who had organized 41 years of daily life around a partnership and who must now inhabit that life alone. The grief she still carries. The aftermath of Blake Edwards' death is, in some respects, the most human dimension of the entire story, the part that strips away everything but the specific reality of a person who has lost the person they loved for 41 years and must now continue to live in a world that his death has made smaller. She has not remarried. She has not, in the years since 2010, described anything resembling a romantic life in the public statements she has made. What she has described, instead, is the ongoing and daily experience of missing him. In a 2015 appearance on Good Morning Britain, she said simply that she was still dealing with the loss. She said she missed him dreadfully on some days. She described the marriage as a true love story and said she would always carry him in her heart, not as rhetoric, but as a precise description of where the grief actually lives when it is genuine, and when the person who is gone was the organizing presence of your daily existence for more than 4 decades. The grief of Blake's death has coexisted with the grief of The Voice, which preceded it by more than a decade, and which has its own ongoing weight. She has spoken in various contexts about navigating a career and a sense of self that had been built entirely around a vocal gift that is no longer available in the form it once was. She can still speak, she can still communicate. She has appeared in films and on streaming series and at public events with her characteristic warmth and intelligence fully intact. But the singing, the specific thing that had been at the center of her identity since she was 9 years old and performing in variety shows across England, is gone, and its absence is a permanent dimension of everything she has done since 1997. She has continued working. The Princess Diaries films, 2001 and 2004, with Anne Hathaway, introduced her to a generation that might not have had a direct relationship with Mary Poppins or The Sound of Music, and established her as someone whose appeal and warmth operated entirely independently of the voice that had originally made her famous. She voiced a character in Despicable Me and its sequel. She appeared as the narrator in Netflix's Bridgerton, beginning in 2020, which brought her into the weekly lives of an entirely new generation of viewers. She has continued writing children's books with Emma, her daughter from the first marriage, who has become her most sustained creative collaborator in the years since Blake's death. The family Blake built with her has continued to hold together. Emma, Jeffrey, Jennifer, Amy, and Joanna, the 5 children gathered across 2 marriages and 2 adoptions, have remained connected to each other and to her with the specific warmth of a blended family that has actually worked. Julie's grandchildren and great-grandchildren have extended the family further, adding new generations to the one that began when a 12-year-old boy got a young performer's autograph at a stage door in Luton. Tony Walton's death in 2022 added another layer to the grief of these later years, the loss of the man she had married first, who had become her dearest and oldest friend and her collaborator on the books she wrote with Emma, and who had been part of her life continuously from the age of 11. His death left a specific gap in the circle of people who had known her the longest and most completely, the people who had been present from the beginning, when she was still becoming herself, before the voice and the films and the marriages and the losses had made her the person she eventually became. What the 2 marriages made. Julie Andrews has described marriage, in the various interviews she has given across the decades, as both a profound and a profoundly demanding thing, as the hardest work she has ever done, harder than the performances and the career and the public life that her extraordinary talent required of her. That assessment, from someone who has been doing the hardest possible professional work since the age of 9, is worth taking seriously. The first marriage, to Tony Walton, was young love that grew in different directions without ever turning hostile or bitter. It was the marriage of two gifted people who were each becoming themselves, who chose different professional paths that eventually pulled them too far apart to sustain a shared domestic life, and who discovered that what remained after the marriage was a genuine friendship. The friendship that replaced the romantic partnership was, in its way, one of the more extraordinary things to emerge from the whole story, sustained across more than 50 years, encompassing creative collaboration and co-parenting, and the specific warmth of two people who had genuinely loved each other and had found a form for that love that outlasted the marriage. The second marriage, to Blake Edwards, was the longer and more complicated and more fully adult love, the love of two people who had each been through the experience of a first marriage ending, who had each done the difficult interior work of understanding their own patterns and needs, and who chose each other from a position of greater self-knowledge than the first time allowed. It produced a blended family of 5 children, assembled across continents and circumstances, a creative partnership of genuine artistic significance, 41 years of daily life shared across Switzerland and California and Broadway and Hollywood, and a grief at its ending that she has not recovered from and may not. She is, at 90 years old, still here, still writing children's books with Emma, still appearing on screen in whatever forms are available to her, still the specific remarkable person that a childhood in Surrey and a career across 7 decades and 2 marriages and 5 children and 1 catastrophic surgical loss and the irreplaceable deaths of the 2 men she loved have together made her. The voice is not what it was. The presence, the intelligence and warmth and specific human aliveness that she brings to every room she enters has not changed. It has, if anything, deepened with everything the years have added to it. She is 90 years old. She is still here. And that, given everything it took to arrive at 90, having lived the life she has lived, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.